For nearly 700 years, one piece of linen cloth has been kept behind bulletproof glass in a cathedral in Italy, and millions of people have come to see it convinced they were looking at the actual burial cloth of Jesus Christ. The faint image on the fabric shows the front and back of a man's body, marked with wounds that seem to match a crucifixion. But in 2015, and then again more recently, scientists pulled DNA off that cloth and ran it through the same kind of genetic sequencing labs used to trace human ancestry and identify criminal suspects. And what came back did not settle the debate the way anyone expected. It complicated it in ways nobody saw coming. Stay with me to the end, because the strangest twist in this story is what the scientists themselves say the DNA actually proves. And it is not what you'd guess. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe now before we get started. Let's talk about the object itself first, because you need to understand its history before the DNA results make any sense. The Shroud of Turin is a herringbone weave linen cloth, roughly 4 meters long, bearing a faint, straw-colored image of a man, front and back, as though the cloth had been laid over a body and folded back over the head. The image shows what appear to be wounds on the wrists, the feet, the side, and scattered marks across the back and shoulders, details that believers have long connected to the biblical account of the crucifixion, including the scourging and the crown of thorns, the cloth's earliest confirmed. Appearance in the historical record dates to 1354, when it surfaced in a small church in Lire, France, under the ownership of a French knight. From there, it eventually passed to the House of Savoy, a powerful Italian noble family. And by 1578, it had been moved permanently to the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, where it remains today. That's the well-documented part of the timeline. Everything before 1354. The 13 centuries between an actual crucifixion in the 1st century and its first appearance in medieval France is essentially a historical gap, filled only with disputed legends about the cloth traveling through Jerusalem, Edessa, and Constantinople before reaching Europe. Notably, the Catholic Church itself has never officially declared the shroud authentic. It's treated as an object of devotion, not a certified relic, and church officials have generally left the scientific question open. The first major scientific test came in 1988, when 3 independent laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona were given small samples of the cloth to radiocarbon date. All 3 came back with strikingly similar results, dating the linen to somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD, which lines up almost exactly with the shroud's documented appearance in medieval France. For most scientists, that settled the authenticity question right there. A 1st century burial cloth should not date to the 14th century, no matter how it was tested. But the result never fully killed the debate, because shroud researchers, often called syndenologists, pushed back hard. Some argued the sample used for testing came from a corner of the cloth that had been patched or rewoven during a medieval repair, meaning the lab might have unknowingly tested newer thread rather than the original fabric. Others pointed to possible contamination from centuries of handling, fires, and one particularly damaging blaze in 1532 that scorched part of the cloth and it required extensive repair work. Neither the original researchers nor most independent chemists have found the contamination argument convincing enough to overturn the medieval date. But the controversy never fully died down, which set the stage for a very different kind of test decades later, one that didn't look at carbon atoms at all, but at DNA. In 2015, a team led by geneticist Gianni Barcaccia at the University of Padua in Italy took on a project that sounds almost too ambitious to succeed. Rather than testing thread fibers directly, they analyzed dust and pollen particles that had been vacuumed off the backside of the shroud during earlier examinations. Material collected from the same regions of the cloth used in the 1978 scientific investigation and the 1988 carbon dating. Using targeted genetic sequencing aimed at plant chloroplast DNA and human mitochondrial DNA, the team set out to identify exactly what kinds of biological material had accumulated on the cloth over its documented history. What they pulled out of that dust was almost unbelievable in its variety. The plant DNA alone represented at least 19 distinct species. Some were exactly what you'd expect from a cloth that spent centuries in the Mediterranean region, plants native to Europe and North Africa. But other plant species traced back to origins in Central Asia, the Middle East, and remarkably to plants native to the Americas, species that, by most historical accounts, weren't even introduced to Europe until after Christopher Columbus's voyages, meaning that particular contamination had to have happened well after the medieval period the carbon dating pointed to. The human DNA told an even stranger story. Rather than finding a single consistent genetic profile, which is roughly what you'd expect if the cloth had only been closely handled by one small, geographically limited group of people, the researchers found mitochondrial sequences clustering into several distinct genetic lineages known as haplogroups, tracing back to widely separated populations. Some of the sequences matched haplogroups typical of Western Europe. Others matched groups more commonly associated with the Near East, the Arabian Peninsula, and notably, the Indian subcontinent. That last detail is what made headlines at the time, because certain haplogroups found on the cloth are unusually common in populations from India today. The researchers floated a genuinely startling possibility that the linen itself might have originally been manufactured in India rather than the Near East, since the specific herringbone weave pattern used in the shroud has historical parallels in Indian textile traditions from antiquity. If true, that would mean an artifact venerated in Europe for hundreds of years, and long assumed to have originated in or near Jerusalem, might trace its very fabric back to South Asia. Here's where the story gets more complicated, though, and this part matters more than the headlines usually let on. Barkaccia and his colleagues were extremely careful in how they framed their own results, and it's worth taking that seriously rather than skipping past it. Finding DNA from people of different ethnic backgrounds scattered across a piece of cloth doesn't automatically prove where the cloth was made. A linen shroud kept on public display and handled by pilgrims, clergy, restorers, and scientists across 7 centuries would be expected to accumulate a wildly diverse mixture of human and plant DNA simply through ordinary contact, completely independent of where the fabric itself originated. The researchers themselves stated plainly that the genetic diversity they found was compatible with either explanation, an Indian origin for the cloth, or simply centuries of contact with people from many different regions during its documented travels through Europe and the Near East. In their own words, they said the data could not tell us anything more definitive about the shroud's true origin. It's a rare example of a scientific team finding something genuinely surprising and still resisting the temptation to oversell it. Then, more recently, the same lead researchers pushed the investigation even further using a completely different technique called metagenomics, which involves sequencing every fragment of genetic material present in a sample at once, rather than searching for specific target genes. Applied to shroud material collected back in 1978, this approach pulled out an almost overwhelming mixture of genetic material. Alongside human DNA, the team found sequences from cats, dogs, cattle, pigs, and an assortment of food crops, including corn, carrots, wheat, peanuts, and even bananas. Some of the human DNA recovered matched known genetic profiles of the very researchers and technicians who had handled the samples decades earlier during previous scientific investigations, a detail that itself says a lot about how easily modern contamination creeps into work on an artifact this heavily studied. When outside experts, including geneticists uninvolved in the study, reviewed these newest findings, several were blunt about what the results actually mean. Rather than bringing science any closer to confirming or denying the shroud's authenticity, the sheer genetic chaos on the cloth may make that question permanently unanswerable through DNA analysis alone. Put simply, too many people, plants, and animals have left traces on this cloth across 700 years of documented history for genetic testing to cleanly separate an ancient signal from centuries of accumulated modern noise. That's a strange note for a scientific story to land on, because it isn't really a discovery in the traditional sense. It's closer to a demonstration of a discovery's limits. The DNA didn't reveal a hidden truth about the man whose image appears on the cloth. It revealed in extraordinary detail just how much human contact an object like this accumulates when it survives for centuries as an object of pilgrimage, veneration, restoration, and repeated scientific study. Every hand that has ever touched the shroud, every pollen grain that drifted onto it during outdoor processions, every insect or animal that brushed against it in storage left a genetic trace behind. Like in modern sequencing, is now sensitive enough to detect practically all of it. In a strange way, the DNA results turned the shroud into something like a genetic diary of everyone who ever came near it, just not the specific single person the image is supposed to depict. So where does this actually leave the argument over the shroud's authenticity? Believers in the relic have generally pushed back against both the 1988 radiocarbon results and these newer genetic findings, arguing that centuries of fire damage, repairs, and handling could have introduced enough contamination to distort the results in either direction. Skeptics counter that 3 independent radiocarbon labs converging on the same medieval date range is exactly the kind of consistent, replicated result that real science depends on, and that the DNA findings, if anything, only reinforce how heavily contaminated and well-traveled the object has been over its documented lifetime, which makes a miraculous, singular origin harder to defend, not easier. Neither side has fully convinced the other, and it's genuinely possible that no future test will settle it completely, since every additional layer of scientific analysis seems to reveal not a clearer picture of the shroud's origin, but a messier one. What makes this story worth telling isn't really whether the Shroud of Turin is authentic or not. It's what the investigation itself reveals about the limits of even our most advanced scientific tools when they're pointed at an object that has spent centuries absorbed into human history. Radiocarbon dating gave us a date. Genetic sequencing gave us a portrait of contamination so vast it may be permanently unsortable. Neither approach delivered the clean, singular answer everyone was hoping for. Instead, both approaches quietly proved something else entirely, that objects like this don't sit frozen in time waiting to be studied. They live alongside human beings for centuries, absorbing pieces of everyone who ever touches them, until separating the original object from everything layered on top of it becomes almost impossible. In a way, that might be the most fitting outcome for an artifact whose entire history has always been defined by faith colliding with evidence, and neither one ever fully winning the argument. If this pulled you into something you never expected to think about, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing history and science collide like this, because there are plenty more strange investigations like this one still waiting to be uncovered. Drop a comment and tell me. Honestly, do you think the Shroud of Turin is a medieval creation? Or do you think there's still a real mystery here worth investigating further? I genuinely want to hear which side you land on. On the next episode, we're heading to a 9,000-year-old site in Turkey that archaeologists have just reopened, and what they found carved into the stone there has left experts struggling to come up with an explanation. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.